Hello and welcome back. You are joining us for episode 2 of a 4-part series where I talk to Don Berg all about democratic education and what progressive schooling looks like. Today's episode is all about what it looks like for students in democratic schooling environments. And if you don't know already, Don Berg is an educational philosopher and researcher. He's studied psychology and he's worked with learners for 20 years. He's based in Oregon and he's written some fabulous books, Schooling for Holistic Equity and the Agentic Schools Manifesto. So let's jump into our conversation. Hi, Don. It's nice to have you today. So one issue that always comes up when we talk about different styles of learning and schooling is when we give students a lot of autonomy and agency, what are they actually going to do day to day? What does it look like to have a day in the life of a student in an agentic school? So can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. One of the problems of describing these schools is answering that question. It's like what is a typical day in the summertime on a break for your kids? Well, you can't answer that question because they're all doing different things. Well, that's kind of like what happens in democratic schools. That's why they're often perceived as chaotic. Now, if you're a careful observer of these schools, when you go in, if you just look at the surface, yes, it looks chaotic. However, if you pay close attention, you can scan each child, each adult, and realize they're doing something. Now, they may be doing different things, but they're all usually, most of the time, focused on something. Now, that doesn't mean they don't get bored. They do. But these schools embrace boredom as a necessary part of the process. Important thing to note is that if these children have come from a traditional environment and are new to a democratic environment, one of the things that is consistently observed is that they will do nothing for an extended period of time. And you have to understand that that is a necessary decompression or healing or deschooling process. The kids have to reorient themselves to who am I here now.
Yeah, their intrinsic motivation, right?
They have to tune into that and figure out what is it that I want, because when you've been trained in an environment in which you are irrelevant to what is happening. Yeah, I mean that's teacher-led education, right? Is at its worst, I should say. Is you just get told what to do all the time. Your muscles for making decisions are atrophied.
The
Yeah,
helplessness epidemic.
that's a strong term, and it has very specific psychological meanings. That, boy, if you're there, that is truly
True.
pathological.
Yeah.
And most of what you get in schools, because I went through them, mainstream schools was my experience, you don't get quite that bad most of the time. But it's definitely on that end of the motivation spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be, that you have to heal from that. And that's what I'm saying is that when you say day to day what's going on, and I'm observing these careful things, is at the beginning of the year, and you have new students in a democratic school, you're going to have some of those kids who are taking weeks or months to decompress and heal.
Wow.
And it is a challenge. It is not easy to deal with for parents or for the staff at the school, because you have a lot of concern. But as has been consistently observed in a variety of settings, not just democratic schools, but also through the homeschooling and unschooling networks as well, it is necessary. And one of the things that, so my perspective on all of this is psychology, and my framework is called self-determination theory. And one of the things that is assumed in self-determination theory is that humans are inherently curious and active. And so when you see a child who is not exhibiting curiosity and being active, then that is not their natural state. They have been trained into that passivity. And so giving them a chance to work their way out of that is part of it. And one of the things is, I'm not saying that the adults ignore the child during their healing process. That's exactly what does not happen. That's what could happen in a different environment that's more structured, because they in a classroom of 30 kids, and one kid's, how many of your kids in that kind of classroom are just coasting along? What in Winthrop's recent book about engagement, she talks about the passengers. And it's like, yeah, a lot of traditional schools have a lot of passengers just sitting there getting by.
It's really paying attention to the learners and helping them feel that psychological safety before they
Right.
can get into the academic work.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the things that in a democratic school, what they're doing is they're attending to, and they check in with the kid. Sure, they're going to let them do nothing for an extended period of time. But every morning, they say, "Hey, how's it going? Hey, what you doing?" The kid may not exhibit a lot of desires, but what they're learning in that environment is, wait, they keep checking in with me.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, they get convinced that in fact they're sincere, because that's the thing that was drummed out of them. Is if somebody pays attention to me, they're just trying to manipulate me, or they're trying to coerce me, or they're trying to otherwise get something out of me that I don't want to give.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons that these democratic schools and unschoolers and things like that really give these kids a lot of time and space is so that they can relearn the idea that no, you can actually have a legitimate, caring relationship with other people. So that's the thing. That's why when I talk about these environments, the central feature of them is relatedness. At first.
Yeah.
And eventually it gets into transition. I describe schools according to their emphasis for the need, to give them the benefit of the doubt. What the mainstream schools are trying to do is support the need for competence. They want competence. Now, they have a twisted notion of how to do that because they're trying to develop externally measured degrees of competence. And that's not the psychological need. The psychological need is a felt sense of competence. And it is independent, like literally independent of their objective competence. So when you're going through this process of retraining and building relationship, one of the things they have to, oh, wait, like I would like to be competent at that. Now, they're not going to say that in those words. Kids aren't articulating these needs. They're doing things that'll happen, that'll have consequences of that. And once they go through that healing process, then they'll say, oh, hey, I want this or that or the other thing. And then they start to shift from protected, isolating themselves from relatedness, in a sense, from others, and then say, oh, wait, I'll associate with these guys. These guys seem to get me, and I'll go with that. But then that gives them the opportunity to be more autonomous, to express more autonomy, more like, oh, I can make this choice or that choice. Now, sometimes they will make a bad choice.
Yeah.
and you'll have to deal with that conflict that arises from that bad choice.
Yeah.
But they will go through this process, and it will start in relatedness, even if it looks like they're resisting the relationship. But that's a healing process. They're once they heal, then they start to express autonomy, and eventually they start building on their competencies as they go along. And that's where oftentimes kids will find that one thing that's like, okay, that I really like truly like, because sometimes they find that the things that they thought they liked were generated by others, generated by the system rather than by their true desire, and so they'll shift things. So there's no typical day because it looks like so many things, but the one thing that's consistent is the school is providing an environment that supports their needs and does not impose on them because of those needs. And so they build a relationship that those kids can then say, oh, okay, who am I in this space, and who do I want to be? Some of the environments actually deliberately ask that. Reviewing an interview I did with Ian Cunningham of SML College in the UK, which is self-managed learning college, and he was talking about how they have these 5 fundamental questions. One of them is, who are you? And they go through this they take a week to just deal with this questions of like, who are you, what do you want, and what do you want to achieve in the world.
Wow.
And then that's something they revisit every year with every kid is, who
Yeah.
are you, what do you want, what do you want to work on.
It's making me think about how mainstream educators could bring in some of these ideas, like
Yeah.
particularly creating time in the schedule that I know Derry Hannon talks about of
Right.
20% independent learning time. But even if you could scratch out a Friday afternoon for
Right.
some curiosity and self-exploration time, that would allow learners to kind of decompress from all the stress and expectations that are put on them by being in the school system.
Right.
And perhaps they can create slideshows, or they could do some research about an idea that they have.
Hmm.
And I'm
Hmm.
thinking even that educators could really benefit from time like that too. Our days are
Right.
so mandated that
Hmm.
having time to explore your own personal curiosities outside of professional development could
Right.
allow you to answer some questions about, like, who am I, what am I doing in this space, what are my actual objectives for being here.
Right.
And it's complicated when you think about this is the only way things have been for so long,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it also isn't, because if we go back in the history, there are different models of education that are just not as prevalent anymore,
Yeah.
such
Oh
as
yeah.
having a private tutor, such as having, Socratic seminars and learning in an apprenticeship style.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's less of a departure from what is currently happening and more of a return to some of the ideals that we've lost from the past.
Yeah. Absolutely. There's nothing new in education. It's just a matter of saying, okay, what's the emphasis? What's mostly going on? When you read How Teachers Taught by Larry Cuban, is an amazing resource because he's going into really 100 years from 1890 to 1990 and saying, what did teachers actually do with children? And of course it's a challenging thing, but what he found is, like, there's all kinds of models and things that came and went. But that's the conclusion he reaches in the book, is to say, unfortunately, while there have been experiments in many interesting, cool things, they all get washed away in the mainstream, unfortunately. And that's the thing I'm finding now, is there's all kinds of amazing things even in publicly funded schools and government managed schools all over the U.S. and the world. There's cool things going on. It's amazing, but there's this other thing, like the mainstream has its effect, and it's like, is it going to last? And that's the work I'm doing to try and bring a more coherent sense of what underlies all of those things and what's effective, no matter what your pedagogy. I don't care personally what your pedagogy is,
Mhm.
other than support those primary psychological needs, because that's your duty of care as a teacher. That's not
Yeah.
that's not the educational mission you're on. It's just the fact that you have a child that's not yours in front of you means you have this specific duty of care, and their primary psychological needs are fundamental to that. So before you're an educator, you have to take care of the children. And that's the underlying commonality, no matter what the pedagogical model.
Mhm. Exactly. I mean, that's one thing I'm doing on this channel, is sharing what's working in schools globally, because there
Hmm.
are some great ideas. And like you said, sometimes it's just borrowing from something that already works in a different context and
Right.
trying it out in a new space. It's not reinventing the wheel at all. And that's why I
Exactly.
want to have this conversation, because democratic schools, it's not about replacing your model in a traditional classroom, because
That's right.
there are big problems that you can't control. It's a system, it's not something you can fix overnight or even work on overnight.
Hmm.
But we can take in little micro actions, such as bringing in independent time, or
Right.
even age mixing, which is another big
Yeah.
component of democratic schools. Like, students are not in age groups. And
Right.
there's been discussion about this, in the public media for a while, of like, why do we still have this factory model of students coming in at age 6, they graduate, etc.
Hmm.
But can you talk more about, like, the age mixing, and like what are the
Oh yeah.
benefits of that?
So one of the interviews I did with I think it's somebody in one of the schools in California. Anyway, she said the secret sauce to the magic of these schools is the age mixing,
Hmm.
because like, if you want really kind of hardcore analysis and some interesting research on it, is Peter Gray has done some really good work on age mixing. um, but age mixing is a benefit for everyone, because the older kids, think about the teenagers, and they look down and they see 6, 7, 8, 9-year old, and they're physically bigger than them, but they realize, like, oh, I have to be responsible. I have to be a model for this other person, this child that's in front of me. And the amazing thing about, so the teenager is leveling up their behavior in terms of being a responsible person, of being a caring human being. And then the kid, the little one, is looking up and saying, that's somebody who's not that much older than me. They look at me, the gray beard, and it's like, oh, he's an old man. But when they see somebody who doesn't even have the whiskers yet, or somebody who's closer to their age, and they say, wow, that's interesting, and they're going to learn from them. They may not always be like, I want to be like him, but they'll find someone they want to be like. They may say, I don't want to be like him, and that's a fair lesson. That's actually a good lesson to learn too. And so teachers are familiar with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development.
Yes.
So one of the things you should understand about that is it works just as much for social skills as it does for academic skills. There's a zone of proximal development. When you put the teenagers with those little ones, is they're both benefiting. And what it does for the teenager is they get stretched because they're being stretched into adulthood type behavior. They're in the attitude of what does it mean to be a responsible person around small people. And then the small person actually has the more obvious benefit. It's like, oh, I have to keep up with these people. It is really beneficial when you can have kids who, like a specific example, there was at Village Free School, there was this 12 or 13-year-old girl who was emotionally really with the 6 and 7s, maybe 8s, but she would go and spend time with them. But because she was older, there were other things, like for instance, the way that particular school organized their morning meetings is that the first meeting of the day was room A, which was all the youngest kids. And then an hour later, there'd be the room B meeting. And then the room C meeting, which is the teenagers, is a little later. And that's just better for teenagers. So she would go to the room C meeting and have a meeting with her peers age-wise. But she would then go down and hang out with mainly room A kids who were up to about 9. And that is one thing, is those are flexible groupings that the kids self-select into. Now they kind of just gravitate into those age groups. Now room A is actually a little different because this is at a time when they had a campus with a school with about 8 classrooms, like traditional hallway with classrooms off of them, about 8 or 9 classrooms, and then over a basement that had a full commercial kitchen and a stage. So she would go have her meeting in room C, but then go and hang out with the room A kids all day, or as much of the day as she wanted. But there's no one saying you have to be in one group or the other. It's just they could self-select where they wanted to be, and the age groups sort of naturally gravitate to themselves, to each other. That's not age segregation in the sense I mean it, because there's no formality that says you can't be. And I was going to say that the room A is a slightly exception because they have so many rooms and they have a commercial kitchen downstairs. Yeah. Room A kids had to be certified to roam the building freely.
Like a badge that allows
exactly.
them to I could go places, kind of like a driver's license.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that these schools, they have some way of making those, helping ensure that kids are safe, given that the default is more of a sort of freedom. But, a commercial kitchen has knives and stoves and dangerous things.
Right.
So it's not okay just to wander in and do stuff. So all of the schools that are big enough to need formality. So there's a level at which, very, very small schools where there are a dozen people or a dozen kids or whatever, like 20 kids, you don't need the formality. But when you get to the formality, they have some form of certifying and saying, hey, you want to use those, you want the freedom or in Village Free School, you want the freedom to roam the school, then that requires this conversation between the student, the parents, and the staff, and say, what does that mean? What does it mean to you to have that freedom? What do you think is necessary? So they learn the ropes, and that can apply to dangerous tools. It can apply to for room C kids usually, actually even some of the room B kids, but at Village Free School was off-campus privilege. So at what point are you free to? You have to understand, you have to sign yourself in and out, because if a fire drill happens, and that is legally required by the fire department, so they do it too. When the fire drill happens, they have to know who's on campus, because if you're not on campus, everyone's searching for you, and the kids can grasp that concept. So certifying the kids to go off campus, they have to know how to do that, and what the implications are if you don't follow those rules, and it's fiendishly difficult to get 6-year-olds to remember to sign in and sign out. And parents, for that matter, sometimes they forget to sign out.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the age mixing in terms of what I've been able to do in elementary classrooms,
Oh yeah,
because
yeah.
working with colleagues who might have been teaching fifth grade and I was teaching first grade, I could do a buddy class
Mm-hmm.
where my students went to their classroom and we read with, the 11-year-olds reading to my 6-year-olds,
Yep.
which was
Yep.
beautiful. And then, we'd invite them to come to our classroom when we were having a writing celebration. So my
Yep.
students got to share their first book with these fifth graders who were like, oh, I remember being a first grader. And that's
Mm-hmm.
one way you can start building this age relationship, even
Yeah.
within the dynamic situation that is a mainstream school,
Yeah.
because not necessarily going to have the option of getting the high school students to come and share a whole lesson
Right.
with you. But there could be opportunities to collaborate on assemblies or
Yep.
have them share some of the research that they're doing. It's always about
Absolutely.
asking what's possible.
Right, and that's one of the I worked in an after-school program at a Catholic school. It was K-8, and they literally had a program matching kindergartners to eighth graders so that they could do exactly that. And so the question is what opportunities do you have? What is the how much of an age span can you organize the connections between? If you are limited and can't create literally mixed classrooms, then these kind of special times when you can get the oldest with the youngest and start to build community. That's another benefit of that, is besides just sort of whatever work they're actually doing, is it's building community and getting a sense of, I remember talking to some of the older kids at that school, and them talking about their eighth grader when they came in as a kindergartner. And that
Oh,
was a really special thing. So
yeah,
it is something where, whatever age span you can arrange, make those things happen.
yeah. I think this is an interesting conversation because so many people wonder about the academics, but when we really zoom out, it's about the relationships that you're building in a school
Absolutely.
community. The
Yeah.
academics can come next, which we can talk about in the next episode, more about the actual assessment and the grades and the tests and maybe not having grades.
Right.
But this overview of what it could look like when you bring more students together and you have this relationship where the students control the dynamic of their curiosity and where they want to explore, who they even want to be with.
Right.
It opens up the possibilities of, like, why is a school system, mainstream particularly, why is it that way? And
Hmm.
is that still supporting the future that we want to have? So
Right.
I'm excited for our next episode where we're going to talk more about assessment.
Great.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. Thank you.
And for anyone watching, remember that you can always leave comments in the space below and let us know if you have another question, particularly around democratic and progressive education, because I can definitely ask Don to come back and talk more about it.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you in the next video.